Excellent, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and sorry again for the delay. Just before I start, this share has been sponsored in Nishmas Devera Bastia Bas Shalom Michal, who is the mother of Adam Katten, who was nifta this time last year. And obviously, we thank her for sponsoring the share, and also our tefillah is that the share should be an ilon neshama for her mother, and we should all be reunited in good health and together.
Amen.
We're looking at the machlokas or the discussion in the Rishonim about the answer to the Gemara. So the Gemara expressed the idea that a Tofer shteitvirus, 2 stitches, is only shel kayama if it's tehusha koshron, if they have been knotted. And the run on the Rif brings in the name of the Re'im a question. The Re'im, the Ureim, assumes, Rabbi Zobin assumes or asks, how can it be? He assumes that it can't be that you're chayiv shtaim, that inherent in Tofer shteitvirus is a chiyuv for another melacha. So how can you do a Tofer without also being shteitvirus, without also being chayiv for a knot? And the answers we're talking about kesher achas, and he proves from this that one knot, a single knot, is not a kesher that makes one chayiv. That's what the Re'im says. Now, I initially didn't understand what sort of single knot is the Re'im talking about. Is he talking about a single knot when you are tying the 2 threads together? So you do your stitch into the cloth such that the 2 heads of the threads come out on the same sides of the cloth because you're stitched through it, and then you knot the 2 heads together. In which case the Re'im is saying that with 2 threads, when they're only singly knotted together, not doubly knotted together, this has no kiyum? Or is this talking about where you knot separately each of the heads of the threads, in which case a single knot on a single thread isn't a good knot, which is more of a chiddush, because such a knot has a great degree of permanence. If you take 1 thread and you just do a single knot, not a double knot, that's quite a tight knot. If it's pulled tight, you can't really unpick it. If you have a double thread, 2 threads, which you knot together in a single knot rather than a double knot, that's a loose knot. So I was a little unsure when I learned the Re'im. Subsequently to that, I looked at the Ritzvah on in source 9, which is on Shabbos Kuf Hei Amud Aleph, later on in the Sukkah of HaKosha, and the Ritzvah explicitly talks about this and makes this very point. And he says if it's talking about knotting the single heads of the threads, a single knot and a single thread is certainly a good knot. The Re'im must be talking about knotting 2 threads together. There, a single knot isn't a tight knot. And I put on the WhatsApp group that really this distinction works its way la Halacha in the Ramah. And I referenced that. We happened to look at that Ramah earlier, where the Ramah gives this as a Pesach, la Halacha, the Ramah in Siman Shin Yud Zayin at the end of Sif Aleph. The Ramah says, now which you need a kesher al gabe kesher, not on top of the knot, what we call nowadays a double knot. That's when you knot 2 threads together. If you made a single knot in the head of 1 thread, that's the same as sheikh sharon. That certainly is a permanent knot. So that's what the Ritzvah later on in Shabbos Kufay says. We spoke last year about what this assumption of the Re'im is, that it can't be your chayiv twice. It's not exactly clear why the Re'im assumes that. And indeed, in the Ritzvah disagrees with that assumption. One answer the Ritzvah gives is maybe your chayiv shtaim. Maybe it's true that in the scenario of 2 stitches, you're only ever chayiv if you do knots, and then you would always be chayiv twice. The Ritzvah is open to that possibility, and it's not entirely clear why the Re'im finds that so impossible. We then began learning through the Ritzvah, and this is what I want to, where I want to start off today. At the bottom of the 2nd page in the handout, source 8, this is the Ritzvah on Al Sugya. And just reading through the Ritzvah again, very quickly, says the Ritzvah, Hikshu B'Toisus. Toisus asks, that Toisus is not a Toisus that we know of in front of us, but it's the The Ram brings it in the name of the Uraim, the Re'im, who was one of the Bali Tosis. V'chayv nami mishum kosher. You should also be chayv for kosher. The Tiritz and then brings an answer which we don't have. Kiven she'ena kashiru ak l'hamid atafira l'chashvina le'ena mishum tofer b'rachot. We discussed this extensively last time. The Ritva says that a knot made only to preserve a stitching is not a good knot. Sorry, a knot made only to preserve stitching is chayv once, not twice. And the way we explained this was because tofer and kosher are similar melachos. A knot, a kosher, normally differentiates itself from stitching, from sewing, because when you sew, you join two fabrics together, whereas when you knot, it's just an interwovenness. If you do a knot to hold stitching in place, that's a means to a stitch, and therefore the melacha is tofer, not kosher. And I suggested that this ritva isn't necessarily telling us a general rule that's applicable or extendable to other melachas. It may be a unique feature of the relationship between tofer and kosher because of their similarity. Either way, the ritva says that when you do a knot with tofer, perhaps you only chayv once for tofer, not twice. Now, I had a short discussion with Jeffrey off group, in which Jeffrey proposed that this is analogous to the concept of melacha she'en tzricha l'gufa. This is an idea we've met previously, that a melacha that you do, I'll give an extreme example. For example, to remove a problem. For example, you carry an object from your house to the street, from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, but your only intention in doing the melacha is to remove it, to not have it, rather than because you want it there. That would be an example of melacha she'en tzricha l'gufa. Or perhaps similarly, if you trap an animal, not because you want an animal, but because you don't want it, you want to keep it away from you because it's a harmful animal, that maybe is a melacha she'en tzricha l'gufa. Now, Jeffrey's argued that this is a similar idea because you don't really want the knot for itself. You want it merely to hold the stitching in place. It's been done for a particular. Karen, also you were saying that this was your Chavruta's suggestion. Okay, I don't agree with this suggestion though for two reasons. The first is because then the Ritva is getting himself caught up in a machlokas tanoim, because of course this is a machlokas Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon, about whether we say melacha she'en tzricha l'gufa is chayav or potter, and the Ritva doesn't address that. He doesn't link it to the machlokas about melacha she'en tzricha l'gufa, because this is an argument in the tanoim. There are tanoim that don't buy into this whole distinction and believe that you are chayav even when you are doing it not for the positive purpose of the melacha. That's the first point. The second point I can't really prove, but my instinct, my intuition is that this isn't good enough. This wouldn't qualify as ein tzricha l'gufa because you do want the knot. Why do we want knots in life? For all sorts of reasons, but the basic reason you want a knot is to attach threads to each other, to hold threads in place. And this is absolutely what you're doing. That's why you want the knot. You want it to hold the thread in place. Why do you want the thread in place? Because of tofer. But that's a perfectly reasonable, positive reason why you want the knot in place. Now, I don't disagree with your analogy entirely. It's in a very large scale that there is an overlap between these concepts in the sense that the Ritva is saying, since the purpose of the knot is for tofer, therefore this is subsumed in tofer. I'm simply arguing that this isn't part of a general rule of ein tzricha l'gufa, because I don't believe it qualifies as that, and the Ritva doesn't say it does. It's a svara he's saying in the relationship between tofer and kosher, that a knot which is made in order to facilitate stitching is part of the stitch, not a knot in its own right. And that to me seems a reasonable svara, and it seems the most modest reading in the Ritva. In other words, we're being minimalists here. We're not extending the Ritva any more than he says. He simply says a knot done to facilitate a stitch, you are only chayv for tofer. And I'm arguing that there's a good svara to say this and not to extrapolate any further. He doesn't mean rules about other melachos. He doesn't mean rules about kosher vis-a-vis other melachos. He doesn't mean rules about tofer vis-a-vis other melachos. He means simply in the relationship between kosher and tofer exactly as he says it. So to me, this is the most minimalistic reading in the Ritva without adding anything into what he says and without extending his principle further. And I understand the rationale and logic in that. And therefore, to me, this seems a good reading in the Ritva.
Can I just say, without talking about ein tzricha l'gufa, but when you do a knot at the end of a thread, you're not tying two things together. So that is, in one sense, maybe not the essence of the melachot or kashira.
It's a good point. We did discuss this when we learned kosher, and we tried to define what the melacha is. But there's no, even if the melacha is creating a knot, because sometimes knots are useful in their own right, there's no getting away from it that a knot is a combination of materials. When you make a knot in one thread, you're simply joining one part of the thread to itself. But even there, I don't think there's a way of completely distancing the concept of a knot from joining fabric to itself, or to another piece of fabric, for that matter. So we discussed this a little bit when we learned kosher, we tried to understand the difference between kosher and tofer. But as I said then, I don't know any knockout blows that could give us a crystal clear definition beyond that which the Aruch HaShulchan said and others said, which is that somehow with stitching it seems to be subsumed into and sort of become one piece of fabric. You're trying to make a functionality of one fabric, whereas knotting doesn't seem to do that.
Why can't we resolve the problem of the liability to both kosher and tofer by looking at the definition of what the chiyuv of the kosher is, which is, we have seen from what you sent us, is maseh uman and kesher shel kayama, and you need understand from the Rambam you need both of those in order to get a chiyuv of kosher. If you only have one of the, because we don't, and they said, and the reason why the Ra'im is saying kesher al kesher is he actually is looking for a double knot, because a double knot is in place of maseh uman, as I understood it.
So this is perfectly feasible. I've avoided studiously in our sugya getting too caught up in a whole chapter of Gemara later, which discusses in detail the qualifications of the knot. So I'm sort of evading this issue. But broadly speaking, just to try and sort of categorize the answers without us needing to get too drawn into them, we have a question over here, a question of a aim. Why are you not always chayiv shtayim if you do two stitches, one for tofer, one for kosher? One type of answer is because you need a kasher al gabi kasher. That's a possible answer. Why you need a kasher al gabi kasher will get us caught up in the intricacies of the sugya and kosher, which I don't want to go into. But basically, you're correct, because you need a solid knot, a very tight knot, a very strong knot, a professional knot, and that's what the Re'im's answer to it is. And that's a perfectly good answer, and that's the answer the Re'im gives. The Ritva gives a different answer, though. The Ritva says that it's not because the knot isn't a good knot, even if it's a great knot, you're not chayiv because you're only chayiv in such a scenario when you do a knot as a facilitator for a stitch. You're only chayiv for the stitch, not for the knot. So the Ritva isn't going into the nitty gritty of is this a great knot or a poor knot. He's simply saying it's always subsumed. So you're right. That's in a sense, that is what the Re'im is answering to the question, but the Ritva doesn't go with that answer. Okay, so this is the second answer of the second answer we can give. This is the answer of the Ritva. The third answer, or the second answer of the Ritva, he says, Amori Harav, my teacher, the teacher of the Ritva learned under two teachers, the Ra'ah, Rab Arna Levi, and the Rashba. They were both Rabbonim in Barcelona at the same time, and some of the most beautiful and productive halachic literature we have is the debates. It's a remarkable coincidence of history that you had two Gedolim living at the same time, engaged in debate with each other, in the same location. You have lots of Gedolim living at the same time, but living in the same city in Barcelona. And we have very, very fruitful conversations between the Ra'ah and the Rashba, in which they engaged in debate, and they shared many students, including the Ritva. And both the Ra'ah and Rashba, to different degrees, were students of the Rambam. So the chain of tradition amongst Spanish Rishonim is the Rambam was a student of the Bali Tosfos, and was one of the figures who brought the Torah of the Bali Tosfos to Spain from North France and Germany. The Ramban, next generation after Ramban was the Rashba and the Ra'ah, and the generation after that is the Ritva and the Ran. So just to help contextualize this, so the Ritva brings from his teacher, either the Rashba or the Ra'ah, a different answer to this question. And he says, Moya Rav's al Pirish, the Koshron Lav Dafka, Eroshakivan Zu al Guvizu B'Shozron. The knot that you are making to keep the stitch in place is not a knot, but a twisting. You're just interweaving the threads rather than knotting them. And that's enough to make the stitch secure, and therefore it's not an impermanent knot. However, it's not enough to make you chayev for knotting. We will come back to that answer when we look at the Ritva in Daf Kuf Hey. So for now, we'll put that answer on hold. Then he says, Yesh Oid Loma, a fourth answer, where you knotted them in order to undo the knot. There's no melachot of kashira because it's almanas lahateh. But for knotting, you are chayev because it's miskayemes achshav, it's currently permanent. Now, when I first saw this Ritva, as I mentioned at the end of the last year, fireworks began going off in my head, because I read the Ritva as saying that even though an impermanent knot, a kesher al manas lahati, is not the malacha of kosher, nonetheless, it's enough of a kiyum for it to be the malacha of Tofer. And this brought us back to the discussion of the last sugya, which we know in many malachas, there's a need for it to be a malacha miskayemes, like writing and building and other malachas. However, kosher may have a heightened requirement of permanence, in which case the Ritva reads beautifully, kosher al manas lahati is not the malacha of kasher. Therefore, for the malacha of kosher, you're potter, but it is enough, even though you're planning to unravel it for Tofer, and therefore for the malacha of Tofer, you're chayiv, and that's how the Ritva answers the question. For Tofer, it's permanent enough. For kosher, it's not permanent enough. However, I believe this is a mistake. I left this as homework. Did anyone give this any thought? Did anyone come up with a suggestion as to why this is a mistake?
An idea. Oh.
Go on, Joe.
Go on.
We thought that it was because he was untying either to continue stitching or because he's now stitched enough that it was going to be kayama in its own right, essentially, the stitching.
Excellent. Josh, is that what you're going to say, or something different?
No, I think something different. I was going to say that I thought the Almanat Hatir was about intention, whereas this was more about the structural aspect. So when he might tie a very good knot that keeps the tefillah in place, but not necessarily, but he wants to untie it later.
Okay, so let me address your point first, and then I'll come back to Martin's point. I think your point is probably correct, but that begs the question that in a sense, that's just another way of phrasing my point. You may well be right that what the Ritva is saying is this is structurally sound, but your intention is to unravel it. But then we have, in a sense, this is my point again, that the Ritva is telling us that intentionality makes a knot impermanent, but doesn't make a stitch impermanent, in which case, again, the Ritva is a good source for saying that stitching has different requirements of permanence to knotting. And I think that's a mistake, and we don't have the Ritva as a good source for that. In other words, any distinction you want to draw between the type of permanence you need for knotting and the type of permanence you need for stitching from this Ritva, I think is a mistake. Because I think Martin's point is spot on. I lost clarity in the maths of the sugya. All the sugya is saying, and this is spelt out in the next Ritva that we will look at in a moment, is that with 2 knots, 2 stitches, the Mishnah says that you're chayav for 2 stitches. If you just do 1 stitch, and it's just a thread through a cloth, you're not chayav for Tofer. If you do a thread in and out, then you are chayav for Tofer. That's what the Mishnah says. That's the minimum requirement for Tofer. Then the Gemara says that you are not chayav for that Tofer because surely it's impermanent. Answer the Gemara, you can fix it in place with a knot. However, the Gemara only says that 2 stitches are not permanent. At some point, you would achieve enough stitches for it to be permanent even without a knot. How many stitches do you need for it to be permanent without a knot? We don't know. The Ritva later will assume 3 stitches are ready enough. In and out, not enough. Add a 3rd stitch, yes enough. By the way, there's a logic for that, because as soon as you go for a 3rd time through the cloth, you end up with a tension. Whichever way you pull, the stitch will pull against itself, and therefore it doesn't easily slip out. If you pull up, the other part of the stitch is down. If you pull down, the other part of the stitch is up. So the 3 is the magic number that means that it doesn't fall apart. So either way, at some point, you no longer need the stitches. When the Ritva is saying that you're planning to undo the knot, the reason, quite possibly, the Ritva is saying you're planning to undo the knot isn't because the stitching is impermanent, but because it's permanent, because you want to carry on the sewing process. The knot is a temporary way of fixing the threads together till you stitch more together. So it's true that at that moment in time when you undo the knot, you have temporarily made your stitching weak and it could be unraveled, but it's a weakness in order to carry on sewing. So this isn't called impermanent, this is called permanent. The point of undoing the knot is because you want to carry on the knot. And therefore the Ritva says this would be a reason not to be chayav for the knot, because the kesher is al manas lahati, is in order to unravel, but you are chayav for the tefillah because this 1 stitch will remain in place in order to carry on and for it to culminate, to be actualized in a continued stitching process. And therefore this is a tefira shel kayama. It's a bit like, this is just a moshel, it's a bit like it's not a contradiction to the permanence of grinding that you're planning to make this into a dough. Because you want the grinding remains because you've used the product of the grinding, which is flour, to go on to the next stage. So it's not a weakness in the melacha, it's a culmination of the melacha. Unknotting the knotting to carry on the stitching isn't a weakness in the tefira, it's a culmination of the tefira because you're now going to continue to sew. It's a weakness and an impermanence in the kasher, but it's not an impermanence in the knotting. So I think this is what the Ritva is saying. I think he's saying a very simple svara, that with respect to the melacha of kosher, you're planning to unknot it. With respect to the melacha tefira, you're planning to continue sewing until you get to 2 or more stitches, such that you no longer need knots there. And this is pretty explicit in the next Ritva in Kofei, which says explicit, you don't need knots once you get to 3 stitches.
I can understand.
Yeah, my question was, if your intention was, just as we said that you're not have a kosher almanach lahatir, would you also not be chayiv for tofer almanach likroa?
We don't know. That's the question. I thought there was evidence from the Ritva that, again, your point is correct. As I said to Josh's point, your point is spot on. We just don't have evidence from the Ritva. When I first read the Ritva, I thought the Ritva was saying that almanat is a factor in kosher, but not a factor in tofer. That's not correct. There's no evidence in the Ritva. So what's the answer to your question? Good question. Who knows? Now, lahalacha, actually, as it happens, almanat likroa is not a leniency in knotting. In stitching, if it's structurally sound, it's enough. But we don't have evidence for that from the Ritva. That's my point.
What if you were to continue untying? Sorry, what if you untied it? What if it was almanat lahatir because I want to take the pieces of cloth apart later?
So we don't know. We have no rhyme in the Ritva. That's my point. Originally, I thought the Ritva was saying that doesn't matter because your intention is to unstitch the stitching. And the Ritva is saying that doesn't matter, nonetheless, you're chayiv for tofer. I now realize that's a mistake. I don't know either way. I have no evidence for the Ritva, what the Ritva would say. All the Ritva is saying is that when you plan to unlock the knot to continue, that's called permanence.
I don't understand why, when you undo the knot, I can't understand that you don't need it anymore once you've done 3 stitches or more.
Yeah.
But you're not actually enhancing the stitching. You just don't need it anymore.
Correct. And therefore?
I thought you were saying you're actually with the intention of, you're unknotting it with the intention of making it easier to stitch, but you're not making it any easier. You just don't need the knot anymore.
Right. So it depends from the perspective of which melacha. From the perspective of kosher, that's a weakness in kosher because the knot is only an ad hoc solution to hold the stitch in place till you finish off the stitching when you no longer need it.
Right.
And therefore the Ritva argues you would be potter for kosher. From the perspective of the stitching, it's not a weakness that you'll undo the knot because you'll undo it because you want to carry on stitching until you no longer need the knot.
Well, you can carry on stitching without undoing the knot.
It's true. Well, I don't know. First of all, you probably can't because the knot will be thick then and therefore it will make it clumsy to stitch. But why would you leave the knot in place? It's just messy.
Yeah.
You want neat stitching, of course, you get rid of the knot. So the point is, from the perspective of stitching, there's no weakness in the fact that you're planning to undo the knot. That's the londas of the Ritva. Okay, so this is the Ritva by us. I want us now to learn through the Ritva in Daf Kuf Hey Omud Aleph, because in a sense this sort of comes out from the Ritva there. And forgive me that we're learning through the Shonim side. I just think in the Sugya it's a good chance for us to engage in a little bit of careful analysis of the Shonim. So now we turn to the top of page 3. Omar Rabbi Yochanan, the Husha Koshram, the parallel Sugya that it has a kiyum and it's knotted. Hiksha Rabbi Lezim, again the same question. You should tell your chayiv because of the kasha. So this is the same as the Run quotes the Re'im, that you need a double knot, a kasha al gabi kasha. That's point number 1 in the Ritva. Point number 2 in the Ritva is he spells out that you only need a double knot with 2 threads, but with 1 thread, a single knot is very tight. The dafka babalik shnei roshei chutzim. This is anyway you're joining 2 heads together. Ki hachad lekam of shekashron. Koloma shekashron shnei roshei chut mekan mekan. Kadei shetamet osfiru velo tishomit, in order that the stitching should hold and not slip. If you just tie a knot in one end of a thread at its head, you're not tying two heads together. Even one knot is enough to be chayev. So this is the next point the Ritzvah makes, and as I said, this enters into Halacha in the Ramah, who says that the requirement of double knots is only with two threads, where you're joining two threads but not with one thread. And now we get to the important point. V'lo nehira. This is incorrect. Even one knot of permanence is a kesha. There's no rule you need a double knot, as long as it's a kesha shel kayama. And here you'd be chayiv when you would be chayiv too. So here the Ritzvah takes the bull by the horns, and he argues with the Re'im's assumption head on. And as we said, we weren't actually sure where the Re'im got his assumption from. And the Ritzvah says you would be chayiv too in this case. Inami, a second answer, the kesha here doesn't mean a knot, it means where you just twist the threads or interweave them as a bow. So this is the answer the Ritzvah said by us also, but in our sugya the Ritzvah didn't elaborate on, and here he elaborates on it. And he says when the Gemara says you knotted it, it doesn't mean you have the halachic knot to make you chayiv for kesha. It simply means you interwove the threads so that they wouldn't easily unravel. And now he adds on the crucial point, the second last line, everyone would agree, if you stitch 3 stitches, even though you didn't knot, you're chayiv, because this is a chiyur mischayeves. The Gemara only asked that 2 stitches, in other words, 1 in, 1 out, is not permanent, because you can just pull it. But 3, everyone would agree, doesn't need knotting, and therefore, if you just twist the threads together, that's equivalent to it. And therefore, 3 stitches is no more than 2 stitches with a bow or with a twisting, and therefore, this is again, he brings this from his teacher, that is enough to make you chayiv, even though there's no knots. So this is a conclusion of the Ritzvah. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but I want to finish this sub-sugya today. So please forgive me if I just take a couple more minutes. And just say outside the 2 very beautiful points from the Tosfos Yom Tov that I shared. The first point the Tosfos Yom Tov says is a delightful reading in a Mishnah. The Mishnah, when it lists the melachos on Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, if you remember back couple of years ago when we first started learning the melachos, this is the Mishnah that we're learning, which lists all the melachos. The Mishnah uses strange language, and it says, Avos melachos aboim chasa achas. The melachos are 40 minus 1. On which the Tosfos Yom Tov asks, why such strange language? Just say 39. So the first answer the Tosfos Yom Tov gives is that this is a style the Mishnah adopts in parallel to a Mishnah in Makkas, which says that you have 39 Makkas, that the punishment, when the Torah gives lashes as a punishment, it means 39, and it uses the language of aboim chasa achas. And in that Mishnah, there's a good reason why such language is used, because the pasuk that we learn out the Makkas from uses the language of Aboim of 40, Aboim Yakenu, and we learn out that it means not 40, including the 40th, but up to 40, i.e. 39. And therefore the Mishnah says you give 40 lashes minus 1 as a way of saying 39. And therefore, as a matter of style, the Mishnah copies this when it comes to the melachos and says you're chayiv for 40 minus 1 melachos, rather than speaking straight and say you're chayiv for 39 melachos. But then the Tosfos Yom Tov gives a second ingenious reading, and he says the reason the Mishnah says you're chayiv for 40 minus 1 is because the Mishnah is trying to list, as per the Gemara at the top of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, why does it list the Avos melachos? Why do we care? Why does it give the number of melachos at all? Just give the list of all the melachos, and who cares whether it's 39 or 50? Just the halachically relevant point is to say, list the melachos. So the Gemara asked this question at the top of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, and it answered by getting us into the structure of how many melachos you could be, how many carbon chatos you could be chayiv for if you did all the melachos b'hana machas, etc., etc. So the point of the Mishnah in listing the melachos and giving the numbers is because you're chayiv for a shogeg in each and every one of the melachos, and if you work your way through all the 39 melachos, you will be chayiv 39 karbanos. Says the Tosfos Yom Tov, if you work your way through all the 39 melachos, you will have done 40 melachos, but you will only be chayiv minus 1. They'll miss 1 in the chiyuv chatos. Why is that? Because you can never, the melacha of Tofer, as listed in the Mishnah, which is state of Yiras, always has to be done in partnership with kosher, except since you've done you've anyway done the melachot of kosher, because that's another one on the list of 39, you will only ever end up chayiv 39. So if you do all 39 melachos, you will have done in the way described in the Mishnah, i.e. the melachah of Tofer is just 2 stitches, you will have invariably done 40 melachos. However, you will only be chayiv chosa achas -1, because you won't be chayiv for the kosher that you did with the Tofer, because you're anyway chayiv for it when you separately did the other one on the list of 39 when you actually did kosher by itself. So says the Tosfos Yom Tov in a beautiful reading of the numbering of the Mishnah. I'm rushing a bit because I'm feeling pressure for time. Is this clear? Does this make sense? Okay. So this is how he reads the Mishnah. You're chayav 40 -1, in other words, you did 40 melachos, including Tofer and kosher to help the Tofer, but you're not chayav for the second kosher because you already did kosher anyway when you did that melachah by itself. Now the Tosfos Yom Tov therefore assumes, like the middle answer of the Ritva in Kufay Omid Aleph, not like the Ureim, and he assumes that indeed if all you did was Tofer and kosher, you would be chayav twice. So says the Tosfos Yom Tov. And he asks, on the view of those which he lists as the Beit Yosef, a question from the previous sugya. Because in the previous sugya, earlier on in Ein Daled on the base, Abaya said, Haiman da Ovid Chalsa, someone who made this basket, chayav Yodalef, you chayav 11 melachos, v'chayt l'puma, and if you stitched the mouth, chayav Yud Gimel, you chayav 13 mechatos. And Rashi explains that you made a lip or a seam, as it were, and you're chayav because of Tofer and kosher, because Rashi says you need to knot after you do the tefillah. So we don't do enough chazorah, and therefore when we got to the sukkah of kosher, we forgot about this comment of Rashi. But actually, when we learned Rashi earlier, this is what Rashi said. So we actually have an explicit Rashi that seems to say that every time you do a knot, you have to do a tofer, you have to do a knot afterwards, and you would be chayav for this kosher. Look at Rashi Divrei Masel B'chayt L'Puma on the 7th wide line in Rashi on the Amud. Lasos do Safa, hosted come tofer v'kosher. These are 2 melachos. Why? Shesarich liksher acha la'acha hatefira. You have to stitch after the tefira, after the sewing, and therefore you're chayav for the stitching and for the knotting, because you have to do a knot after the sewing, and therefore you're chayav twice. And the Tosfos Yom Tov says this is a knockout blow. This is mufurish that at least the view of Rashi, learning the Gemara, that says that when you make the lip, you're chayav 2. It's explicit that you're chayav both for the kosher and for the Tofer. So says the Tosfos Yom Tov. Now, the Rashash, the Tosfos Yom Tov, just in terms of history, is from the generation after the Marshal, very, very prominent and important Achron. The Rashash is a relatively late Achron. He lived in Vilna in the 1800s. He was actually a fascinating individual. He was a working man who engaged in business and also in the Talmud Chacham. He built up an enormous library. Very exceptional, remarkable individual, but not one of the senior Achronim in terms of the halachic process and perish on the Gemara. I don't mean to compare great figures, but in the halachic process, not a senior Achron, and Tosfos Yom Tov is certainly a senior Achron. Nonetheless, the Rashash here argues with the Tosfos Yom Tov, and it's very hard not to view it as a knockout blow. The Tosfos Yom Tov's comment is very, very strange, because all the Gemara is saying is that when you do 2 stitches, you're only chayiv if you put a knot in place, otherwise it won't be permanent. When you do the seam on the basket, you're not just doing 2 stitches, you stitch all the way around. You've done a whole asik of sewing. So why are you putting the knot in place? Not because otherwise you won't be chayiv the melachah because it won't be permanent enough. It crosses the threshold of permanence needed to the melachah. You're putting the knot in place because that's what the basket needs, probably in order to stop the thread unraveling over time. But the thread is certainly permanent enough to be chayiv. Or maybe it just needs the knot for the production of the basket. So all Rashi is saying is that the stitching needs the knot, not because otherwise you won't be chayiv because all you've done is one in and out. You've done a whole length of stitching, you've done enough to be chayiv, but because it's a good manufacturing is to knot it at the end so that the threads are not left hanging and that it doesn't eventually detach itself. In such a scenario, everyone would agree you're chayiv. Let's take the Londos of the Ritva. The Ritva said because the knot is subsumed to the stitching. But in this case, is it subsumed? The stitching is a good stitching even without it. We don't have evidence that in this case it would be subsumed. The Ram said, the Re'im said that you only did a single knot. But in this case, and a single knot's not permanent. But in this case, presumably you did a permanent knot because you want it to be permanent. Your whole point in doing it is because you don't want it to unravel. The Ritva brought another answer that you just twisted it. But here Rashi says you knotted it. Then the Ritva brings another answer that you do it al manas to unknot it. But over here you don't do it al manas to unknot it because you're producing a basket and you want the basket to last a long time and therefore you leave the knot in place for a long time. Therefore, at least according to most of the answers, if not all of the answers, we don't understand the Tosfos Yom Tov's point. It's not controversial if you're manufacturing a basket and you stitch it with plenty of stitches and at the end you knot it because you just want to tie off the thread to stop it unraveling or catching, that you would be chayav for that kosher. That was never controversial. The whole discussion is in this unique scenario where you do a knot in order just to facilitate the stitching to make you chayav, whether you'd be chayav 2 or 1 in that case. So this is the Rishash's critique of the Tosfos Yom Tov. From this Nokaplo, I don't know what the Tosfos Yom Tov meant. So we have a beautiful reading of the Tosfos Yom Tov in Abba and Chas Achas, and then we have a second comment of the Tosfos Yom Tov against the viewpoint that you wouldn't be chayav, arguing that Rashi and really the Gemara argues on that, and an answer of the Rishash. So I'll stop there because I've gone way over time and I apologize for that. If this was too rushed, I'm happy to discuss off group more about this. Otherwise, we will conclude here. I'm happy, as I said, to do a quick run through this again next year. But in Hashem, next year we will start the. I'll send out more sources and we'll finish off the sugya in the next year. I hope that we'll have probably one more share just on the sugya before we finish.